Good morning, church family. I'm here in Lima, Peru, and before I get into my update, I just want to point out that it's cloudy here. It is not sunny. So Fuma sent me a message this week asking why is it always sunny when I do my videos? And I don't have a good answer for that, Fuma, other than the fact that I think the clouds really like Norway. But today they're here in Lima too. And it's kind of crazy because Lima is actually a desert on the coast. I can see the water from here. And it gets cloudy, but it almost never rains. But it's been a great visit. I've been hanging out here with Pastor John Thompson of the Union Church of Lima. He has a real passion for how to activate his members to be on mission, to be missionaries on a secular payroll like we talk about at North Sea, and to see Lima transform for Christ, both through the international church ministry as well as supporting local churches. And so we've been talking about different ways that MICN might be able to come alongside him and help him. For example, one of the things we've talked about is connecting him with our friend Rodney Wu in Singapore, because some of the things Rodney dealt with in his church are similar to what John's dealing with here in Lima. You know, it's interesting because international churches are in some ways all the same and yet totally different. We all deal with transient populations, people that typically because of their work move a lot. We also have multinational congregations. We typically use English as our primary language. On the other hand, being an international church in Lima is a very different context than Stavanger or Dubai or Beijing or Tokyo, and so each one has its unique challenges. And interestingly enough, from our discussions, identified that some of what John is dealing with is similar to something Rodney dealt with 10 years ago in Singapore. So I've offered to connect the two of them so that he can have chats with Rodney. Also, I had a great discussion yesterday, a Zoom call with John Gerlach, our friend in Midland, Texas, who supports Love Hanoi, the work we're doing in Vietnam, also supports our work in Malawi. And as you know, they've launched Love Midland last year, and it's been incredibly successful. Well, John, I got to introduce him to Jakob Bloomberg from Hanoi when we were in Korea a couple weeks ago, and John is considering launching Love Lima. And so that's John Thompson here, so I talked to Pastor John Gerlach in Midland about would his church be willing to come alongside the church here in Lima and support them, and he is very interested in having that discussion. So we'll leave it on Pastor John in Lima to pray about it and consider the next steps, but if he decides to move that way, then I'll be connecting him and John Gerlach to talk about how Crestview might be able to provide training or financial resources or other ways of supporting even short-term teams down here in Lima. So I really believe God is using this trip, and we're going to see great fruit coming out of it in the future. Now tonight, so Sunday night, I'm flying out to Asuncion, Paraguay on an overnight flight. Unfortunately, I think the flight is like 4 hours, and that's about all the sleep I'll get if I sleep. So I'm sure I'll get a little bit of sleep. It's going to be a rough night, but I'm going to Asuncion, Paraguay, because we're looking at whether or not we should plant an international church there. Now, you may be wondering, why Asuncion? I mean, we've planted a church in Oslo in the last 2 years, and that makes a lot of sense. That's in our own backyard, in our own country. But why am I so far away looking at a church plant? And that's because planting in Paraguay is much bigger than just Asuncion. It's about launching a movement of church planting across the globe. So the dream I have is to create regional teams of international churches that are working together to plant where there's needed places, where there's places that need international churches in their regions. And we have the most momentum currently here in the Americas. And that's why I added this on to my trip to South America, because I want to work with John here in Lima, because he has volunteered to be our regional church planting coordinator for the Americas, and also work with Werner, who's our regional coordinator for the Americas, to build out this structure and to build out kind of a process, as well as just the strategy going forward. And that starts in Asuncion. We've already identified Belize. And then from that, we want to replicate this structure in Africa, Europe, and Asia. And so that's the dream that I've got. And that doesn't mean that I'll be traveling to each of these places. Actually, quite the opposite. That is not my desire, although it'd be exciting. The idea here is to create a process and a model that we can replicate so these churches can do it in each of their regions. But it's something that I'm pioneering within MICN. And so it takes me being on the ground and working intimately with Werner and John here in South America to help create the structure, to recruit the right people, and then once we see that it's moving forward well, then to help replicate it with other teams around the world, so that we're not only celebrating a church plant in Oslo and a church plant in Asuncion, but hopefully celebrating church plants all over the world in the years to come because of this. So it's really the beginning of a global initiative for something absolutely incredible. And there's nobody else doing this. There's no one else who's focused on planting international churches around the world. And just imagine what it would be like to live in a city like Stavanger or Asuncion and not have North Sea, not have a church like ours. And yet that's the reality for people in Oslo until we planted there. And it's the reality for people in a lot of places around the world. And the global migrant population is growing. Right now, 300 million people live outside their country of birth. And many of you watching this video are included in that number. So am I. Right? But the estimate is that number is growing in the coming years to 800 million people. So the need for international churches in cities around the world is only going to grow. And yet who's going to plant them? And if we don't, who will? I mean, cows give birth to cows and pigs give birth to pigs. So I believe it's international churches that have to give birth to international churches. So that's my goal in my heart. And I appreciate your prayers that God will use this not only to give us clarity and discernment on whether or not we should plant in Asuncion, but also to help guide and form this process so that we can inspire and empower international churches around the world to come together in teams and do exactly this, planting international churches, as well as then that spurring on the planting of local national churches in countries around the world. So thank you for your prayers. Bless you all. I can't wait to be back with you in person in a week and get to just catch up in person there. All right, God bless you. Have a great Sunday.